The winter of 1883 came down on the Dakota Territory like a hammer. It was not a gentle, meandering cold that crept into the bones over weeks, but a sudden, violent assault that shattered the placid blue of the autumn sky and replaced it with a sheet of unforgiving iron gray. The wind, born in the barren Arctic, did not whisper through the cottonwoods along the river. It howled, a predator searching for any crack, any seam, any weakness in the meager defenses of the men and women who had dared to stake their claims on that vast, empty land. For the small settlement of Northwood, a collection of a dozen log cabins huddled together as if for warmth, this was the season of truth. It was the season that tested the mettle of a man, the strength of his walls, and the depth of his woodpile. The cold did not knock before it entered. It seeped through the daubing between the logs, no matter how carefully mixed with mud and grass. It poured through the gaps in the floorboards and descended from the ceilings, a constant, invisible waterfall of frigid air. Frost grew on the inside of the walls, delicate, beautiful patterns of ice that were as deadly as they were intricate. They were a sign of failure, a glittering testament to the heat being stolen from within. The settlers of Northwood fought back with the only weapon they knew: fire. The cast-iron stoves in the center of their one-room cabins glowed a dull, angry red, their appetites for split oak and ash insatiable. The sound of the settlement was the rhythmic chunk of an axe during the day and the roar of a hungry fire at night. But the fire was a losing battle. The heat it generated rose to the ceiling and was immediately leached away by the frozen roof timbers. The log walls, some of them nearly a foot thick, became conduits of cold. A man could press his hand against the inner wall of his own home and feel the brutal truth of the prairie winter reaching for him. Families lived in a small, shrinking circle of warmth around their stoves, wrapped in wool blankets and animal hides, venturing to the edges of the room only when absolutely necessary. Children's coughs echoed in the small spaces, a dry, rattling sound that struck fear into the hearts of their parents. Woodpiles that had looked like mountains in October were reduced to hills by December, and the true deep cold had not even arrived. This was the universal struggle, the shared suffering that bound the community of Northwood together. They fought the cold the way their fathers and grandfathers had, with thick logs, tight chinking, and an abundance of firewood. It had always been enough before. But the Dakota Territory was a different beast, and their old ways were failing. Into this landscape of shared hardship stepped Elias Thorne. He was a quiet man, made quieter by the loss of his wife to fever 2 years prior. He was now the sole protector of his 2 small children, a 7-year-old daughter named Lydia, and a 5-year-old son, Samuel. The community saw him as a decent man, but an odd one. He was not quick with a joke or a story. He spent more time observing than talking, his gaze often fixed on the way the wind sculpted the snow into drifts, or how the frost formed on a single blade of prairie grass. While other men relied on the accumulated wisdom of generations, Elias seemed to trust the quiet evidence of his own eyes. He had a handful of books he had brought with him from the East, books on engineering and natural philosophy, and the settlers often saw the light of his lantern burning late into the night. They mistook his studiousness for impractical dreaming. Elias had endured the previous winter in a hastily built cabin, and it had nearly taken his son. He had watched Samuel's breath plume in the air inside their own home, had felt the life-stealing chill radiating from the walls, and had sworn he would not face another winter the same way. All summer and autumn, while other men were content to patch their daubing and add to their woodpiles, Elias had been thinking. He had watched the squirrels build their nests with layers of leaves and grass. He had read about the insulating properties of still air in one of his books. He had come to a conclusion that was, in the context of Northwood, profoundly heretical. The log cabin, the very symbol of frontier strength and self-reliance, was a flawed design. A thick log was strong, yes, but it was also a thermal bridge, a highway for the cold to travel directly into a home. His idea was simple in principle, but radical in practice. He would not build a single, thick wall of logs. Instead, he would build two thinner walls, a frame of wood on the outside and another on the inside, separated by a gap of 18 inches. And that gap, that empty space that other builders would have seen as wasted, was the heart of his invention. He would fill it, from the stone foundation to the roof rafters, with tightly packed prairie hay. The hay itself was a poor conductor of heat, but its true genius, he believed, was in the millions of tiny air pockets it would create. He would build a house not of wood, but of trapped air, a house that wore a thick, warm coat. He began by drawing the shape in the dirt with a stick. Silas Blackwood, the most respected builder in the settlement, a man whose dovetailed corners were things of local legend, was the first to see it. He stood over the drawing, his arms crossed over his barrel chest, a frown creasing his weathered face. "What is this, Thorne? Two cabins, one inside the other?" "A wall," Elias said, his voice soft. "An outer frame and an inner frame. The space between will be filled." Silas grunted. "Filled with what? More wood?" "Hay," Elias replied, meeting the man's gaze. The silence that followed was heavy with disbelief. Then Silas let out a short, sharp laugh. It was not a friendly laugh. It was the sound of a man who had just heard the most foolish thing in his life. "Hay? You're going to build a house of grass? What happens when it rains, Thorne? You'll be living in a pile of rot. What about the mice, the rats? They'll think you've built them a palace. And a spark from the stove? The whole thing will go up like a torch." He shook his head, the laughter turning to a kind of pitying scorn. "Stick to what works. Thick logs, good chinking. That's how a man keeps his family safe." The verdict spread through Northwood like a prairie fire. Elias Thorne was building a fool's cabin, a hay house, a mouse hotel. The men would stop by his plot of land on their way to the woods, leaning on their axes and offering unsolicited advice. They warned him of rot, of fire, of vermin, of collapse. Their words were meant to be helpful, a rough frontier kindness aimed at saving a man from his own folly. But underneath the advice was a current of mockery. The idea was so contrary to their experience, so fundamentally strange, that it became a source of amusement. The children in the settlement took to calling his unfinished structure the Grass Castle. Elias listened to it all, nodding politely, and then he went back to his work. He was not driven by pride or a need to prove them wrong. He was driven by the memory of his son's shallow breathing in a freezing room. He was building for Lydia and Samuel. The laughter of his neighbors was just noise. The work was slow and solitary. Elias began not with wood, but with stone. He dug a foundation deeper than anyone in Northwood had ever bothered to, laying a course of heavy field stones that rose a full 2 feet above the ground. This, he knew, would keep his wooden sills away from the damp earth and the melting snow. Silas Blackwood, passing by, remarked that he was building a fortress, not a home, and that all that digging was wasted effort. Elias just kept working, his hands raw from the stone, his back aching. He set the heavy sills for the outer frame first, mortising the corners with a precision that surprised those who bothered to look closely. Then he erected the studs, creating the skeleton of the outer wall. Next came the inner frame, a mirror of the first, leaving that crucial 18-inch gap all the way around. It looked flimsy to the passers-by, a lattice of thin wood that a strong wind could surely topple. They compared it to the solid, reassuring bulk of their own log walls and shook their heads. Elias sheathed the outside of the outer frame and the inside of the inner frame with rough sawn planks, creating a tall, hollow box. His cabin had no visible strength, no sign of the rugged endurance they all prized. It looked like a crate. The most laborious part was the hay. He didn't just use any hay. He spent weeks cutting the driest, coarsest prairie grass from the highest ground, letting it cure under the late autumn sun until it was brittle and golden. He knew moisture was his enemy, the catalyst for the rot everyone predicted. Then came the packing. He couldn't just toss it in. He fed it into the gap between the walls in small batches, using a long wooden pole to tamp it down again and again until it was dense and compact. It was exhausting, repetitive work. Dust filled his lungs, and the sharp ends of the hay sliced at his hands. For every foot of wall height, he spent hours packing the insulating fill, ensuring there were no empty pockets, no channels for air to move. He was building a solid block of insulation, not just a loose filling. While Elias toiled at his strange, slow task, the rest of Northwood prepared for winter in the time-honored way. The air rang with the sound of axes biting into oak. Men worked together, their movements efficient and practiced, to re-chink the walls of their cabins with a fresh mixture of clay and dried moss. They hauled wagon loads of firewood from the river bottoms, stacking it in long, proud ricks that stood as a measure of a man's foresight. They looked over at Elias, working alone, tamping his worthless grass into his flimsy walls, and they felt a sense of security in their traditions. Their work was hard, but it was known. It was proven. They would be cold, yes, but they would survive, as they always had. Thorne, they figured, was courting disaster. His woodpile was noticeably smaller than anyone else's, a clear sign of a man who did not understand the elemental arithmetic of a Dakota winter. Elias ignored the sideways glances and the murmurs. He focused on the details. He designed a flue for his stove that was different, with a gentle S-bend inside a brick and clay chimney. His books told him this would capture more of the heat before it escaped, radiating it back into the room, instead of sending it straight up into the sky. He built shutters for the windows that were not single planks, but hollow boxes he also filled with packed hay. He caulked every seam, every joint, every possible entry point for the wind. His work was not about brute force. It was about 1,000 small battles against the cold, a war of attrition fought with patience and precision. By the time the first snows came, his cabin was finished. From the outside, it looked unremarkable, a simple plank-sided house. But it was what lay unseen within its walls that would make all the difference. He moved his children in, lit the stove for the first time, and waited. The test came in the second week of January. The sky, which had been a pale, washed-out blue, turned the color of a deep bruise. The temperature, which had been hovering near zero, began to plummet. The old-timers felt it in their bones, a particular sting in the air that promised something terrible. They called it a white hurricane. It began not with snow, but with wind, a low moan from the northwest that grew steadily into a deafening, relentless shriek. It picked up the loose snow from the ground and flung it sideways, a horizontal blizzard that erased the world, reducing visibility to less than an arm's length. Then the new snow began to fall, fine and hard as sand, driven by winds that gusted to over 60 miles an hour. The temperature fell to 10 below zero, then 20. By the second day of the storm, it was 35 degrees below zero, and the wind made it feel like 70 below. The world outside was a maelstrom of white fury. Nothing could live in it. It was a storm that found every flaw, every forgotten crack. It was the ultimate test of a man's work. Inside Silas Blackwood's cabin, the strongest and best built in Northwood, the family was in a state of siege. The wind hammered against the north-facing wall like a battering ram. It forced its way through the chinking, creating tiny, whistling drafts that cut like knives. The thick oak logs, which had seemed so mighty, were now giant blocks of ice, radiating a penetrating cold that no fire could defeat. Silas's wife and 3 children were huddled on their beds, buried under a mountain of buffalo robes and wool blankets, yet still they shivered. The frost on the inside of the walls was no longer delicate. It was a thick, white crust of ice. Silas stood before his stove, feeding it log after log. The firebox roared, the iron glowing cherry red, but the heat barely reached the other side of the room. The stove was consuming his precious woodpile at a terrifying rate. He had been so proud of that woodpile, but now he watched it dwindle with a growing sense of panic. He was burning through a week's worth of wood every day, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. The cold was winning. Just 100 yards away, inside the fool's cabin, the world was different. When the storm hit, Elias felt the house shudder under the first great gusts, but then it settled. The sound of the wind was muffled, a distant, hollow roar rather than an immediate, terrifying shriek. Inside, the air was calm. There were no drafts, none. Lydia and Samuel were not huddled in bed. They were sitting at the small wooden table, drawing on a piece of slate. Elias had lit the stove that morning, and he kept it burning at a low, steady rate, adding a single small log every hour or so. The stovepipe radiated a gentle, even heat throughout the single room. Elias walked over to the north-facing wall, the one taking the full, brutal force of the blizzard, and placed his palm flat against the wooden planks. It was cool to the touch, but it was not cold. It was not stealing the life from the room. The 18 inches of packed hay and trapped air were holding the line. The temperature inside his home was a steady 65 degrees. For 3 days and 3 nights, the white hurricane raged. In the main settlement, a grim reality set in. The battle was lost. Families abandoned any pretense of normal life and went into pure survival mode. They huddled together, sharing body heat, rationing food, and feeding their fires with a grim sense of desperation. On the 3rd night, Silas Blackwood faced a terrible choice. His woodpile was nearly gone. The last of his oak was burning in the stove, and he had maybe 2 hours of fire left. After that, the cold would come for them. He knew that trying to get to the woodline in the storm was suicide. He also knew that staying in the cabin without fire would be a slower, but just as certain, death sentence. There was only one other option, a humiliating, desperate long shot. He had to face the man he had mocked. He had to see if the fool's cabin was any warmer than his own. He wrapped himself in every layer he owned, pulled a thick wool scarf over his face, and told his wife he was going to Thorns. She begged him not to go, but the sight of his children shivering uncontrollably hardened his resolve. He tied a rope from his door handle and paid it out, his only lifeline in the blinding chaos. The journey of 100 yards became an Arctic expedition. The wind tore at him, trying to rip the breath from his lungs. The cold was a physical force, a crushing weight that seeped through his clothes instantly. He stumbled, fell, and crawled his way forward, following the faint outline of Elias's cabin that appeared and disappeared in the swirling snow. When he finally reached the door, his beard was a solid block of ice, and his hands were too numb to knock. He simply fell against it. The door opened, and Silas tumbled inside, bringing a blast of wind and snow with him. The first thing that hit him was not the sight of the room or the people, but the feeling. It was a solid wall of calm, steady warmth. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an overdriven stove, but a gentle, pervasive comfort that seemed to emanate from the very air. He blinked, his eyes stinging from the cold, and took in the scene. Elias Thorne was sitting at the table, reading a book by the light of a kerosene lamp. His children were asleep in their beds, covered by a single quilt, their faces peaceful and rosy. The stove was giving off a low, quiet hum, its fire door shut tight. There was no desperate roar, no frantic feeding of logs. The warmth was just there. Silas struggled to his feet, shaking the snow from his coat. He was speechless. He looked from the sleeping children to the calm father to the quiet stove. It made no sense. He took off a glove and reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and pressed it against the interior wall. He was expecting the biting, soul-sucking cold of his own logs. But the wood was neutral. It felt like a piece of furniture, like the table or a chair. It had no temperature. It was not fighting him. He looked at Elias, his face a mask of confusion and disbelief. "How?" he managed to croak, his throat raw. "My fire is nearly out. We're freezing. My walls, they're covered in ice." Elias Thorne did not smile in triumph. He did not say, "I told you so." There was no hint of gloating in his eyes, only a quiet, weary compassion. He simply stood up, went to the stove, and poured a tin cup full of hot coffee. He handed it to Silas. "The walls aren't the enemy here," he said, his voice even. "The walls are the shield. The hay, the air trapped in the hay, it stops the cold from getting in. The heat we make stays with us." He gestured to his small, neat stack of firewood by the stove. It was barely diminished. "I've used less than a quarter cord since the storm began." Silas stared at the woodpile, then back at his own near-empty woodshed in his mind's eye. The sheer, impossible efficiency of it was staggering. He had burned through nearly 2 cords of wood to achieve a state of shivering misery, while Elias had used a fraction of that to create a small pocket of summer in the heart of a blizzard. The laughter, the mockery, the confident pronouncements of rot and fire and folly, it all came crashing down on him. He wasn't just wrong. He was dangerously, arrogantly wrong. His pride had made him deaf, and his tradition had made him blind. He had lectured this quiet man on survival, while his own family was now facing the very real possibility of freezing to death. The coffee warmed his hands, but a different kind of warmth, the scalding heat of shame, rose in his chest. He took a sip of the coffee, the first truly warm thing he had felt in days, and looked at the man who had built this impossible house. He was looking at a genius. The storm broke on the 5th day. The wind died down, and a weak, watery sun appeared in the sky, illuminating a world transformed, buried under immense drifts of snow. As soon as it was safe, Silas went back to his own cabin, his mind reeling. He returned to Elias's home an hour later, this time with his wife and children. They stepped inside, and their reaction was the same as his: stunned silence, followed by tears of relief from his wife as she felt the enveloping warmth. Elias welcomed them without question, sharing his food and the quiet comfort of his home. Word spread through Northwood as people began to dig themselves out. It started as a rumor. The Thornes had ridden out the storm in comfort. No one quite believed it until they saw it for themselves. One by one, families made the pilgrimage to the fool's cabin. They would enter, stamping snow from their boots, their faces raw from the cold, and stop dead in the doorway. Their eyes would widen as they felt the warmth, a warmth that their own homes, which had consumed mountains of wood, had failed to provide. They would touch the walls, their expressions a mixture of awe and confusion. They saw the small woodpile, the peaceful children, the simple efficiency of it all. The laughter was gone, replaced by a deep and profound respect. The house of grass had stood when the houses of oak had failed. A week after the storm, Silas Blackwood appeared at Elias's door. He was not there to share a meal or to seek shelter. He held in his hand a carpenter's pencil and a small, leather-bound notebook. He looked at Elias, his face stripped of all its former pride. There was no arrogance left, only the weary humility of a man who has come face to face with his own ignorance. He did not waste time with pleasantries. "Teach me," he said. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of the entire community's conversion. "Start from the beginning, the foundation, the framing, the hay, everything. I need to learn how you did this." Elias invited him in. He did not see a defeated rival, but a fellow survivor who wanted to protect his family. He held nothing back. He drew diagrams in the notebook Silas provided, explaining the importance of the deep stone foundation to combat frost heave and moisture. He detailed the construction of the double frame, emphasizing the need for structural integrity so the weight of the packed hay wouldn't bow the walls. He spent an hour talking about the hay itself, the right kind to cut, the necessity of absolute dryness, the technique of tamping it down so tightly that it became a semi-rigid block, leaving no room for vermin to tunnel or for air to circulate and steal heat. He explained the design of the chimney flue, the insulated shutters, the obsessive sealing of every crack. He shared his knowledge as a gift, freely and without expectation of praise. He was not a teacher lecturing a student. He was a man sharing a vital discovery with his neighbor. Silas listened, his pencil scratching furiously across the pages, absorbing every detail, his respect growing with every word. That spring, a new sound echoed across the settlement of Northwood. It was not just the sound of axes, but the sound of saws and hammers. Under the guidance of Silas Blackwood, who now spoke of Elias Thorne's methods with the zeal of a convert, the people began to rebuild. But they were not building the same cabins. They were building Thorne's cabins. They dug deep foundations and erected double-framed walls. They spent the summer cutting and curing vast quantities of prairie hay. Silas, the master of the dovetail joint, became the master of the insulated wall, overseeing the construction, ensuring every detail was replicated with the same precision Elias had used. He gave Elias all the credit, telling anyone who would listen, "I build with wood. Thorne builds with warmth. It's time we all learned the difference." The landscape of the settlement physically changed. The new houses, and the old ones that were retrofitted with an outer shell and a layer of hay, looked different. They were thicker, more substantial. But the real change was invisible. It came the following winter. It was another cold one, with bitter winds and heavy snows. But the feeling in Northwood was entirely new. There was no desperation. The woodpiles lasted twice as long. The cabins were not just survivable, they were comfortable. The sound of children coughing was replaced by the sound of them playing. The ever-present, bone-deep chill was gone, banished by a simple, elegant idea and the quiet man who had trusted it. The story of the hay wall houses of Northwood spread across the territory. Traders, trappers, and new settlers passing through would spend a night in one of the cabins and leave in the morning, marveling at the warmth and the small amount of wood it took to maintain it. They took the idea with them, sketching the design on scraps of paper, spreading the knowledge across the plains. The Northwood Wall became a new standard for prairie construction, a quiet revolution born of desperation and ingenuity. It saved countless lives in the brutal winters that followed, a legacy of warmth spreading from a single, humble source. Elias Thorne never sought credit and never received any official recognition. He remained a quiet man, content to raise his children in the warm, safe home he had built for them. Years later, when his son Samuel was a grown man with children of his own, he asked his father if he ever felt bitter about the mockery he had endured. Elias, an old man by then, sat by the stove in the same warm cabin and looked at the wall, as if seeing the memory of the packed hay within. "Pride is a poor insulator, son," he said softly. "It keeps out good ideas and lets in the cold. I wasn't trying to be right. I was just trying to keep you warm." It was the perfect summary of his life and his contribution. In a land defined by its unforgiving harshness, where survival was a daily struggle against the elements, one quiet man had discovered that the greatest strength was not in resisting the cold with brute force, but in understanding it with quiet wisdom. He had listened to the wind and the grass, and they had taught him how to build a home.